Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in that world, I talk quite a bit about villains. If you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know I tend to give them extra scrutiny, more so than most heroes and protagonists. Now, a lot of that has to do with my own personal tastes. I often find villains, antagonists, and evil characters in general uniquely compelling. I don't always like them, but I am fascinated by what drives them. They don't always have to be complex like Walter White or Magneto, and they don't have to be too basic either like Megatron or Emperor Palpatine. They can all be compelling in their own unique way. But what makes them compelling? Well, that varies considerably from villain to villain. And it's worth talking about, especially when that villain stands out in such a profound way. And this brings me to Gorr the God Butcher, a relatively new villain from the annals of Marvel Comics. But he's one of those rare villains who left an incredible mark shortly after he debuted. And his impact is bound to get even bigger now that he's being portrayed by Christian Bale in Thor: Love and Thunder. And he's definitely a character worth talking about. And since I'm making this video before the release of the movie, I hope to offer some insights into why I think he's so compelling, as well as uniquely menacing. Now, full disclosure, Gorr is one of my favorite villains at the moment. And a big reason why I'm so excited to see Thor: Love and Thunder has as much to do with Gorr as it does to seeing Natalie Portman become the Goddess of Thunder. And that's because, at this point in the MCU, I believe that Gorr is the perfect villain to confront. Not just for Thor, but for the entire MCU. Because who he is and why he does what he does will challenge them in a critical way. It also has larger implications that are worth contemplating. But to appreciate why Gorr is such a great villain, it's necessary to know a bit about his backstory. He first showed up in Thor: God of Thunder Volume 1 by Jason Aaron and Esad Ribic, which was released in 2012. But he quickly set himself apart from most villains that Thor had faced. And regardless of how different Gorr is in the movie, I highly recommend checking out these comics. I'll leave Amazon links in the description because his story and how it affected Thor is incredibly impactful. Within these comics, we learn that Gorr did not come from an ideal background, to say the least. He wasn't some proud warrior, a brilliant scientist, or some descendant of a noble bloodline. He was just an ordinary alien being, living a harsh, unenviable life on a nameless planet. Society was primitive and superstitious, not unlike the early days of humanity. They all struggled and suffered just to survive the planet's harsh conditions. But they endured as best they could. And, much to Gorr's chagrin, they constantly prayed to their nameless gods for aid and blessings. Even though those gods don't answer, and nothing ever comes from such prayers, his people still espouse an intense faith. And over time, this bothers Gorr more and more. In addition, he endures some very unfortunate events. His mother is murdered, his wife dies, his child dies, and his people still struggle constantly just to make it through the day without starving to death. Eventually, he comes to an inescapable conclusion. Either the gods they're praying to aren't real, or they don't give a damn about them no matter how much his people pray. It is a harsh, bitter conclusion, one that seems supported by a lifetime of extreme hardship. But, logical or not, Gorr is cast out by his people as a blasphemer. And without the support of his people, that could have been the end of his story. Then, one day, a couple of gods come crashing onto his planet. They weren't there to help or answer any prayers. They were just two gods fighting one another. Something that happens a lot, both in the Marvel Universe and in many mythologies. And Gorr, already on the brink of starving to death, happens to be nearby. But upon learning that gods are real, Gorr's first instinct isn't reverence. It's hatred. Burning, unceasing, unparalleled hatred. gods were real all along. His people prayed endlessly to them. But they did nothing. Not when his mother is killed, not when his wife dies, not when his child dies. They had the power to battle across the cosmos, but they couldn't be bothered to help his suffering people. So, when one of the injured gods asks for help, Gorr does not give it. Instead, he takes the all-black necrosword, which one of the wounded gods had been wielding, and uses it to butcher both gods. That marked the first time Gorr killed a god, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the centuries to come, and yes, I said centuries, Gorr continues a bloody rampage across the cosmos. His goal is simple: kill every god. Not just the gods his people worship, not just the gods of a particular pantheon either. All gods, every single one of them. It's an effort that eventually leads him to crossing paths with Thor back in the early 8th century before he wielded Mjolnir. But that battle did not go as expected. Gorr was unable to kill Thor, and for a time, it seemed as though Thor had slain the infamous Butcher of Gods. But he didn't. Gorr survived the battle, and eventually he returned, and he grew even bolder, seeking to do more than just kill every god one by one. He actually ends up enslaving several gods to construct a bomb, one that, when detonated, will kill every single god across the entire Marvel Universe. He calls it the God Bomb. While I could spend all day gushing about how great this battle was, my words could never do it justice. Again, I highly recommend everybody check out the comic. If nothing else, it perfectly demonstrates the breadth of Gorr's hatred for gods. If Thor: Love and Thunder can capture even a fraction of what made this story great, then it'll make for one of the greatest cinematic spectacles ever filmed. But in lieu of just belaboring how great this story was, let's take a step back and see the bigger picture surrounding Gorr. Because his story, his motivations, and his actions say a lot, both in terms of deeper messages and larger themes. And that ultimately does matter a great deal in the comics that followed his arrival. We can only hope that we get something similar in the MCU. Yes, Gorr's hatred of gods is undeniably extreme. But in the context of his story, it's easy to understand where that hate comes from. Remember, he comes from a people and a world that needed gods more than most. He didn't have superpowers, and neither did anyone else in his race. And they weren't looking for the gods to solve all their problems and turn their world into a utopian paradise. They just needed someone, anyone, to help them. The situation that Gorr's people faced is not unique either. The Marvel Universe is populated by trillions of beings. Human, alien, mortal, and divine. And the vast majority of them are not superheroes, nor are they superpowered in any way. But whenever heroes and gods conflict, those simple, ordinary beings are usually the ones who suffer the most. They never get a say in anything. At any given moment, they could just be nothing more than collateral damage, their lives disposable as any building or rock. Now, it would be one thing if something prevented gods like Thor, Odin, and Zeus from interacting with mortal beings. But for the most part, there are no such barriers. If any of them wanted, these gods could have come down to Gorr's planet, showed off their godly powers, mingle with the mortal populace, and do whatever they pleased, be it selfless or selfish. The fact they didn't, the fact they had all this power, knowledge, and insight, yet chose to do so little, that does not sit well with Gorr. And why should it sit well with anyone? After all, gods exist in the Marvel Universe. They exist in the MCU as well. That alone is not a trivial detail. Even if their powers are just physics we mortals don't understand, that doesn't change the implications. They could, if they wanted to, use their divine powers to make life better for entire civilizations. or at the very least, ease the suffering of races like Gorr's. And it really wouldn't be that taxing for any of them. After all, they're gods. But they don't do any of that. Not because they can't, but because they choose not to. It doesn't matter whether it's due to malice, negligence, or just divine laziness. When they wield power on that level, their inaction constitutes an egregious misdeed. Even if they don't cause any of the suffering, the fact they don't stop it when they easily could makes them culpable on some levels. And it's this dynamic that makes Gorr so unique as a villain. Because his motivations don't come from what others do, they come from what others don't do. The fact these gods could have helped him and his people but chose not to is almost as bad as if they themselves inflicted all the suffering. In some respects, Gorr's motivations are a dark reflection of Spider-Man's famous saying about great power and great responsibility. Gods in the Marvel Universe do indeed wield great power. But more often than not, they use it very irresponsibly. Thor himself has been irresponsible throughout his long life. Even in the same story, Thor's reckless and lascivious behavior is on full display. And yet, mortals still pray to them. People still have faith in them. On top of all that, plenty of mortal women and men are eagerly seduced by them. Gorr the God Butcher sees all of that. He sees what many others have seen with the gods that inhabit the Marvel Universe. But unlike every other mortal who isn't in a position to do anything about it, he chooses to take action. He takes it upon himself to butcher the gods who stood by while countless others were butchered, often due to factors beyond their control. You can call his recourse extreme, and rightfully so. But the more you scrutinize Gorr's motivations, the more understandable they become. That sort of thing is rare for a villain. Most of the time, you can see where the logic breaks down in a villain's underlying goals, be they pure evil or understandably sympathetic. With Gorr, you can even genuinely appreciate where he's coming from, at least until he starts making bombs meant to kill every god that ever lived. And in the MCU, this understanding is just as applicable. Remember, Thor was in a position to stop Thanos from killing half of all life in the universe. Being an actual god, you could argue he was in the best position. And had he gone for the head like Thanos said, the snap may never have happened. But even before that fateful moment, just look at the circumstances leading up to it. The Asgardians clearly knew of Earth. It's stated outright in the first few Thor movies that gods had visited humanity. They even inspired plenty of worship. But beyond all that, they really didn't do too much. They didn't help humanity advance. They didn't step in when humanity committed horrendous atrocities against one another. Even when there were Infinity Stones present on Earth, a major incentive for intervention if ever there was one, the gods of Asgard just sat back and did nothing. Just take a moment to imagine how many opportunities they had to step in and do something, anything to change how the major events of the MCU played out. It's hard to know for sure, but the fact they were gods and still couldn't prevent one mad titan from slaughtering half of all life in the universe, well, what does that say about them? Is their inaction every bit as egregious as the actions of Thanos? From Gorr's perspective, the answer is yes. And he actually seeks to do something about it. Whether or not you agree with his extreme actions is entirely up to you, but the implications extend far beyond anything he ultimately does in the comics, or even the movies, depending on how Love and Thunder plays out. For the comics, his impact eventually culminated with Thor being rendered unworthy of wielding Mjolnir. In the 2014 event Original Sin, 3 simple words: Gorr was right, ultimately rendered Thor, and every god in Asgard for that matter, unable to lift the enchanted hammer. Now at the time, it did seem like a bit of a contrivance. But in terms of the larger context surrounding Gorr's story, they carried a great deal of weight. It was as though everyone on Asgard had contemplated those words, but none dared to say them out loud. And as soon as someone said it, there was no more ignoring it. Thor wasn't just unworthy of the power of Mjolnir. All gods were unworthy. Eventually, mortal woman Jane Foster ended up wielding Mjolnir. And trust me, there's a lot I could say about that story, but I'll save that for another video. But it's that deeper meaning, that cold, callous observation by someone who dared to judge gods by their inaction, that highlights the true breadth of Gorr's story. And it's the kind of story that resonates beyond any comic or movie. It dares to make us wonder how much we should judge others by their inactions rather than their actions. When it comes to dealing with other people, even if those people have superpowers, we generally understand that actions will always carry more weight. Because most people can only do so much, even those with resources, talent, and time. But for those who wield immense, tangible power, be it through politics, wealth, or prowess, their inactions also tend to carry more weight. Just ask yourself, if someone has the power to make life-saving medicine free with a single phone call but chooses not to, are they responsible for the deaths and suffering that follow? If someone has the means to end a war with a single order but chooses not to, are they responsible for all the carnage that follows? Even on a smaller scale, if someone had the power to end someone's suffering by pushing a button but they chose not to, are they not responsible? Now, these are not easy questions to answer, and I'm certainly not smart enough to debate them. But when gods are involved, beings like Thor, Ares, Odin, or Zeus, the answers get a lot more complicated. I mean, just imagine for a moment being in Gorr's position. You've suffered all your life. Then, one day you learn gods are real and they could have done something to help you, but chose not to? How would you react? How would you feel? Gorr chose his brutal path, and he never faltered. But what path would you choose? And in the grand scheme of things, was Gorr really right? I'll leave those questions to you, the audience. For now, I hope I've given everyone a new appreciation for this character. And I really do hope that Gorr shines in Thor: Love and Thunder. He's a great villain who dares to challenge characters like Thor in a unique way. He also challenges us, the audience, to think harder about what it means to be a god, a hero, and everything in between. And for that, he deserves our respect. But just don't worship him. He hates that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.